Loretta Jean Okafor was 38 years old the November evening she pulled over on I-77 southbound in a hard rain and changed a stranger's tire in the dark. And she did not know a single thing about the man standing beside her on the shoulder of that road. She drove a 12-year-old Civic with a slow heater and a crack in the rear bumper from a parking lot incident she had never had the money or the time to address. She wore her work clothes still, because there was no version of her evenings that allowed for a change. Scrubs from the clinic, running shoes, a rain jacket her son Marcus had given her for Christmas 2 years prior that was one size too large, and that she wore anyway because it had been chosen with real thought, and that mattered to her more than fit. She was a licensed practical nurse at a community health clinic off Tivola Road in Charlotte. And she worked 5 days and sometimes 6. And she drove the same route home every evening at the same time, and she did not stop for strangers. She stopped for this one because his hazard lights were the amber-colored kind that pulsed slowly in the rain like something tired and asking, and because her mother had told her once that the quality of a person was determined by what they did when it was inconvenient. She had no idea the man she was helping had not driven his own vehicle in 11 years. She had no idea that what happened in the months that followed that roadside would change the shape of the rest of her life. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The November rain had been coming in sheets since 4 in the afternoon, the kind that made the clinic parking lot into a shallow river by 5 and soaked through the gap at the top of Loretta's rain jacket collar before she reached the car. She had sat in the Civic for a moment, with the engine running and the defrost on, and her hands flat on the steering wheel, doing the accounting she did every evening, what was left in the week, what was owed by Friday, what Marcus needed, and when and whether the numbers converged in a way that held. They usually held. Barely. With attention. Marcus was 11, tall for his age and precise in his thinking in the way of children who have been raised with honesty about the weight of things. He was at her neighbor Miss Addie's apartment right now, doing homework at the kitchen table while Miss Addie watched her programs. An arrangement that cost Loretta $40 a week, and that was worth every cent and more. Because Miss Addie was the kind of woman who corrected a child's grammar at the dinner table and believed in it. Loretta had grown up without that consistency and had spent her adult life building it into everything she could reach. Her mother, Dorothy, had raised her in a 2-bedroom apartment in West Charlotte without apology for what they did not have, and with a severity of expectation about what Loretta was to become that had felt in childhood like pressure, and had felt in adulthood like the most important inheritance she had received. Dorothy had died 6 years ago of a stroke that arrived on a Tuesday morning with no announcement, and Loretta had grieved her in the deep and wordless way you grieve someone who was also your foundation, and had gotten up the following week and gone to work, because that was the only way she knew to honor what Dorothy had taught her. Dorothy had said, more than once in the particular way of a woman who spoke in sentences that were meant to be carried, "Baby, you do not get to choose when someone needs help. You only get to choose whether you are the kind of person who gives it." Loretta had carried that. She kept the car clean because Marcus had inherited her sense of order, and because a clean car was one of the few things in her life that cost nothing and returned something. The back seat held a crate with jumper cables, a folding rain poncho, a flashlight, a basic tool roll, and a spare that she had checked the pressure on 2 weeks ago at the Citgo on Tivola. Because she had read once that most roadside emergencies were caused by things that could have been addressed in advance, and she had no patience for preventable failure. The tool roll had been her father's. He had left it behind when he left everything else behind. When Loretta was 9, and Dorothy had kept it in the closet and given it to Loretta at 18 with a practicality that was also a kind of poetry. Here is what he left you that was worth keeping. Loretta had used every tool in it, learned every one, added 3 of her own over the years. She knew the difference between a torque wrench and an impact wrench, and how to treat a lug nut that had been over-tightened by someone who did not understand what adequate meant. She was not a woman who called for help when her hands could solve the problem. That was the detail about Loretta Jean Okafor that mattered. That was the one that would pay forward. The hazard lights appeared at the bottom of the long curve before the Brookshire Freeway exchange. A silver sedan sitting at a precise and dangerous angle on the narrow shoulder, close enough to the traffic lane that the spray from passing cars was washing over the rear wheel well in regular pulses. She saw the flat before she fully decided to stop. She pulled in behind the sedan with her own hazards on and sat for 3 seconds, and then got out into the rain. The man standing beside the passenger door was somewhere between 55 and 65, with close cropped gray hair and the particular posture of a man who had spent decades in rooms where decisions were made, but who was, at this specific moment, entirely outside his competence. He was wearing a coat that had cost more than Loretta's monthly car payment and holding a phone that had not yet produced the result he needed. He looked at her the way people look when they are simultaneously relieved and embarrassed. He said, "I called the service. They said 40 minutes. Loretta opened the Civic's rear door and took out the tool roll and the poncho and said, "I've got a spare if yours is the same size." "Let me look at it." He said, "Ma'am, you don't have to." She said, "I know." She was already at the rear of the sedan. The flat was a right rear. The spare in his trunk was full size and matched. She worked with the deliberate efficiency of someone for whom efficiency was not a performance, but a condition of life. Jack positioned at the pinch weld. Lug nuts loosened in the correct cross pattern before the wheel left the ground. The flat off and stowed before the rain had fully soaked through her second layer. The man held the flashlight when she asked him to hold the flashlight and otherwise stood back and did not offer assistance she had not requested, which she appreciated more than he knew. She torqued the lug nuts to hand tight in order, then snugged them down in pattern, then went around a second time. She lowered the jack. She said, "You'll want to get that flat repaired or replaced before you put too many miles on the spare. The spare's rated to 65 miles an hour and shouldn't go more than 50 miles before you address the original." The man said, "I understand. I will." He said, "How much?" She was already walking back to the Civic. She said without turning, "Drive safe." She got in. She pulled into traffic. She drove home. She was at Miss Addie's door 14 minutes later, dripping in the hallway, and Marcus looked up from his homework and said, "Mama, you're all wet." And she said she was aware of that, and Miss Addie handed her a dish towel and did not ask. Loretta did not think about the man on the shoulder of I-77 again that evening. There was dinner to make, and a permission slip to sign, and a uniform to hang dry, and a medication chart to review for a patient she was monitoring. The rain was still coming when she finally turned the light off at 10:43. She thought, that spare will hold him fine. Then she slept. It was 2 weeks before she thought of it again, and only because of the envelope. It arrived on a Thursday, addressed to her by name at the clinic address, and an envelope of the kind that did not come from anyone she regularly corresponded with. Thick stock cream paper, typed label, the return address a business suite on South Tryon Street in Charlotte. She opened it at her desk on her lunch break, reading between bites of the sandwich she had made at 6 that morning. Inside was a letter on company letterhead, Grantham Petroleum Group, LLC, and a handwritten note on a separate card, 3 sentences in careful, deliberate handwriting. The letter, signed by a woman named Carol Pittman, identified as Chief Operating Officer, explained that the company had been made aware of an act of assistance rendered on the evening of November the 14th on Interstate 77 southbound. It noted that the company's founder and chairman, Mr. Edward Grantham, had been the recipient of that assistance. It stated that Mr. Grantham would like to express his gratitude directly and at a time of her convenience, and that Miss Carol Pittman was authorized to arrange a meeting at whatever location Loretta found most comfortable. The handwritten card said, "You did not ask my name. I did not ask yours. I am asking now. My name is Edward. I owe you a conversation, at minimum. I hope you will allow it." Loretta read both documents twice. She turned them over. She turned them face up again. She looked at the Grantham Petroleum Group letterhead, which meant nothing to her yet, and she folded the letter and the card back into the envelope and put it in her bag and returned to the medication chart. That evening, she searched the company name. She sat back in her chair. Grantham Petroleum Group had been founded in 1991 by a man named Edward Langston Grantham, who had started with a single service station in Rock Hill, South Carolina, purchased with a loan his mother had co-signed and a lease arrangement that most commercial lenders would not have touched. He had operated that station himself for 4 years, learned everything there was to know about fuel distribution and retail margin and what customers actually wanted, and what they would forgive and what they would not, and had then purchased a second station, and a third, and had spent the following 30 years building a privately held regional fuel and convenience network that now operated 307 locations across 5 states, from Virginia to Georgia. He was 61 years old. He was, by the most conservative estimates available in the business press, worth somewhere in the range of $400 million. He had been in the back seat of his company car when the rear tire failed, traveling home from an airport, and his driver had pulled over and called the roadside service, and then been struck by a sudden illness that required him to leave the vehicle. And Edward Grantham had been standing alone on the shoulder of I-77 in the rain when a 12-year-old Civic had pulled in behind him with its hazards on. Loretta closed the laptop. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the apartment, Marcus asleep down the hall, the rain still moving against the window. She was not a woman given to fantasy or to the amplification of good fortune before it had been verified, because Dorothy had taught her the cost of that particular habit, and she had absorbed the lesson completely. What she allowed herself was a single, honest assessment of what the information meant. A man she had helped, correctly, efficiently, without ceremony, had found her. He had used actual effort to find her, a driver's account, a city, a clinic name half visible on a jacket in the rain, and then someone working through 4 possible matches before landing on the right one. That was not the effort of a man satisfying a social obligation. That was the effort of a man who had decided that something mattered and had committed the resources of his intention to following through. She thought about her father's tool roll in the back of the car. She thought about Dorothy's sentence, "You only get to choose whether you are the kind of person who gives it." She thought, well, I am that kind. I have always been that kind. And here is what that looks like, from the outside, to someone who can see it. She went to bed. She did not tell Marcus in the morning. There was nothing to tell yet. She had learned not to carry things she had not yet verified. She wrote back to Carol Pittman on her lunch break. She said she was available on the following Saturday, and that she preferred to meet somewhere she was already comfortable. She suggested the cafe 2 blocks from the clinic where she took her lunch when she had time. The meeting lasted an hour and 40 minutes. Edward Grantham arrived before her and stood when she entered and shook her hand and thanked her before they sat down, plainly and without performance, The way a man thanks someone when the gratitude is real and does not require architecture. He was a compact, deliberate man with a particular quality of unhurried attention that Loretta associated with people who had learned, through long experience, that most things worth knowing took longer than impatience allowed. He asked about her work. She told him. He asked the kind of follow-up questions that demonstrated he had listened to the first answers. She asked about his. He told her with the frankness of a man who had made his peace with what he had built and did not need to perform it. He told her about the first station in Rock Hill. He told her about his mother, Iris, who had co-signed the loan at 72 and had told him, "You find out what you are made of when you are the only one left on the road." He had not known what she meant when she was alive. He understood it more each year since she had been gone. He told her he had spent the past 2 weeks trying to identify her through the only information he had. The description his driver had given from a distance, the Civic, the Charlotte plates, a clinic name his driver thought he had seen on her jacket. Carol Pittman had worked through 4 possibilities before locating Loretta through the clinic's public staff directory, cross-referenced with patient review records that mentioned a nurse who had helped a colleague change a flat in the clinic parking lot the previous spring and who kept a tool roll in her car. He said, "You changed my spare in 11 minutes in a hard rain and drove away without asking for anything." She said, "That's not unusual. That's Tuesday." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that it was, in his experience, very unusual indeed, and that he had built 30 years of a business on the ability to identify it. He said he had a proposal. He said it was unusual, and she was under no obligation, and she should take whatever time she needed. He was looking for someone to lead a new initiative, a workforce training and career placement program he had been developing for 2 years through the Grantham Foundation, his family's philanthropic arm. The program was designed to move individuals from entry-level service employment into certified technical and management tracks through a combination of sponsored certification, mentorship, and guaranteed placement within the Grantham network. It needed a director, not an executive with credentials from a business school, someone who understood what it meant to work a job that required your full body and all your attention, and still get home in time to sign the permission slip. Someone who would not treat the participants as a project, but as people. The position paid $94,000 per year, with benefits, a company vehicle, and a flexibility arrangement he was prepared to negotiate around whatever constraints her current life required. The Foundation's offices were 6 minutes from the clinic. Loretta looked at her coffee. She said, "I'm a nurse, not a program director." He said, "You are a person who stops in the rain when it's inconvenient and does the work correctly and drives away without wanting credit. That is a harder thing to find than a program director." She did not say yes that day. She said she needed 2 weeks to think. She went back to work. She thought about it between patient charts and during her drive home and in the 40 minutes after Marcus went to bed that were her own. She was methodical about it the way she was methodical about everything that mattered. She wrote the considerations down on a legal pad, practical and specific, and she looked at them without sentimentality. The salary was real, and its meaning was real. The flexibility arrangement was not something she would accept on faith, but it had been offered in writing, and Carol Pittman had followed every communication with a precision that suggested the offer was what it appeared to be. The work itself, building something for people who looked like her, who were working with the same margin she had managed for 11 years, who needed a pathway that did not require them to pretend their lives were different than they were, was not merely interesting. It was the thing she would have wanted someone to build for her. Once, when she was standing at the beginning of all of this and could not quite see how it would hold. She talked to Miss Addie on a Sunday afternoon while Marcus was at a friend's house. Miss Addie, who had raised 4 children on a single income and who had seen every permutation of a woman standing at a crossroads and knew the face they made, listened to the full account without hurrying it. When Loretta finished, Miss Addie was quiet for exactly 1 moment. She said, "Loretta, do not be a fool." Loretta said, "I'm not a program director." Miss Addie said, "You are the woman who kept Marcus fed and in school and with clean shoes on his feet for 11 years on a nurse's salary, and you did it by being more organized and more disciplined and more clear-headed than anyone I have ever personally observed. That is what a director is. The title is just paper." Loretta looked at her hands. Miss Addie said, "Your mother did not raise a woman who needed permission to walk through an open door." She thought about Dorothy. She thought about the tool roll in the back of the Civic and the sentence that it sent her out into the rain, and what it meant to have led a life that positioned you, quietly and without announcement. For a moment like this one, a life built from the right materials and the right sequence did not always announce itself, but it accumulated. And there were days when the accumulation became visible in a way you could not ignore. She thought about Marcus. She thought about the $40 a week for Miss Addie and the slowly heating Civic and the crack in the rear bumper and the uniform hanging to dry and all the things she had held in place by main force of attention and discipline for 11 years. She thought about what it would mean to hold them less hard, to have margin, to pour from a vessel that was not always at the edge of empty. She called Carol Pittman on a Wednesday morning from the clinic parking lot before her shift and said yes. She gave 4 weeks' notice. Her colleagues threw her a party in the break room with a sheet cake and handmade signs. 3 of them cried. Loretta did not cry. She hugged every one of them and told the 2 youngest nurses what she knew about the work, and she meant it as the transmission it was. 14 months had passed. Loretta Jean Okafor sat at a desk in a corner office on the 3rd floor of the Grantham Foundation building on South Tryon Street and looked at the class roster for the program's 4th cohort. 41 participants, 27 already placed in certified technical roles within the Grantham network, 8 in active mentorship tracks, 6 completing the final examination sequence for their fuel systems management certification. She had built the curriculum herself, with input from the people inside the Grantham network who knew the work from the ground up, and she had insisted that every component pass a single test before she included it. Would this have helped me, at 26, holding a job with one hand and a child with the other, and a future with neither? If the answer was yes, it stayed. If it was no, she replaced it with something that would. The office had a window that faced east, and in the mornings the light came in at the same low angle she had known her whole life and loved without ever naming it. The Civic was in the parking garage below. She had not replaced it. She had had the bumper repaired, the heater serviced, the tires rotated and balanced. It was paid for, and it was hers, and it ran correctly. And she saw no reason to announce something different. Marcus had noticed the repair, and had said, with the precise satisfaction of a 12-year-old who remembers things, "You finally fixed the bumper." She had said she had. He had nodded and gone back to his book. Dorothy would have recognized that exchange. The program's 2nd cohort had included a woman named Addie Jean Marchand, no relation to Miss Addie, who had come in with a GED and 8 years of experience as a gas station attendant, and who had, in the 9 months since completing the program, been promoted to assistant site manager at a Grantham location in Rock Hill, and was on the regional management track. Loretta kept her placement file in the top drawer of her desk and opened it occasionally, not for professional reasons, but because some things were worth looking at to remember why the work was worth doing. Edward Grantham had attended the second cohort's graduation ceremony and had shaken every hand and known every name, which Loretta had noted and which had confirmed what she had suspected from the CAF meeting, that he was a man who had built 300 stations by understanding that the person doing the work and the person receiving the service were the same kind of person, and that if you forgot that, you built something profitable. If you remembered it, you built something lasting. He had left her a note after the ceremony, 2 sentences, in the same careful handwriting as the first card. The note said, "My mother would have liked you. I think she would have said you were the kind of person who found the right ground." Loretta had put that note in the same drawer as Addie Jean Marchand's file. Outside the window, the November morning was bright and cold. The same season it had been on the highway that night. The same rain scrubbed quality of the light. She wrapped both hands around her coffee and thought about a woman standing on the shoulder of I-77 in a rain jacket, one size too large, and a tool roll that had belonged to a man who had not been worth keeping, but had left behind something that was. Dorothy had been right about most things. You did not get to choose when someone needed help. You only got to choose what kind of person you were. She had always known the answer to that. He was free. She was free. She was solvent. She was unbothered. And the work she was building, one person at a time, was level and true, and built to last. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.